Petrus Ramus was an influential French humanist, logician, and educational reformer. A Protestant convert, he was killed during the St.Bartholomew's Day massacre. Early life. He was born at the village of Cuts in Picardy. His father was a farmer. He gained admission at age 12 to the Collège de Navarre, working as a servant. A reaction against scholasticism was in full tide at a transitional time for Aristotelianism. On the occasion of receiving his degree in 1536, Ramus allegedly took as his thesis Quaecumque ab Aristotele dicta essentiae commentatia esse, which Walter Jung paraphrases as follows: "All the things that Aristotle has said are inconsistent because they are poorly systematized and can be called to mind only by the use of arbitrary, mnemonic devices." According to Jung, this kind of spectacular thesis was in fact routine at the time. Even so, Jung raises questions as to whether Ramus actually ever delivered this thesis. Early academic career. Ramus, as graduate of the university, started courses of lectures. At this period he was engaged in numerous separate controversies. One opponent in 1543 was the Benedictine Wikipedian. He was accused by Jacques Charpentier, professor of medicine, of undermining the foundations of philosophy and religion. Arnaud Dorsat, a pupil and friend of Ramus, defended him against Charpentier. Ramus was made to debate governors over 2 days. The matter was brought before the Parliament of Paris, and finally before Francis I. By him it was referred to a commission of 5 who found Ramus guilty of having acted rashly, arrogantly and impudently, and interdicted his lectures. Royal support. He withdrew from Paris, but soon afterwards returned, the decree against him being cancelled by Henry II, who came to the throne in 1547. Through the influence of Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, he obtained a position at the Collège de Navarre. In 1551, Henry II appointed him a Regius Professor at the university, but he preferred to call himself a Professor of Philosophy and Eloquence at the Collège de France, where for a considerable time he lectured before audiences numbering as many as 2,000. Pierre Galland, another professor there, published Contra Novum Academiam Petrus Ramus Oratio, and called him a parricide for his attitude to Aristotle. The more serious charge was that he was a nouveau academicien, in other words a skeptic. Ordo Maristalius, a close ally of Ramus, had indeed published a work in 1548 derived from Cicero's description of academic skepticism, the school of Arcesilaus and Carneades. After conversion, in 1561 he faced significant enmity following his adoption of Protestantism. He had to flee from Paris, and, though he found an asylum in the Palace of Fontainebleau, his house was pillaged and his library burned in his absence. He resumed his chair after this for a time, but in 1568 the position of affairs was against so threatening that he found it advisable to ask permission to travel. He spent around 2 years in Germany and Switzerland. The Second Helvetic Confession earned his disapproval in 1571, rupturing his relationship with Theodore Beza and leading Ramus to write angrily to Heinrich Bullinger. Returning to France, he fell a victim in the St.Bartholomew's Day massacre. Hiding for a while in a bookshop off the Rue Saint-Jacques, he returned to his lodgings on the 26th of August, the 3rd day of the violence. There he was stabbed while at prayer. Suspicions against Charpentier have been voiced ever since. Pedagogue. A central issue is that Ramus's anti-Aristotelianism arose out of a concern for pedagogy. Aristotelian philosophy, in its early modern form as scholasticism showing its age, was in a confused and disordered state. Ramus sought to infuse order and simplicity into philosophical and scholastic education by reinvigorating a sense of dialectic dialectic as the overriding, logical and methodological basis for the various disciplines. He published in 1543 the Aristotelianum Adversions and Dialectic Partitions, the former a criticism on the old logic and the latter a new textbook of the science. What is substantially fresh editions of the partitions appeared in 1547 as Institutiones Dialectici, and in 1548 his Scholae Dialectici. His Dialectique, a French version of his system, is the earliest work on the subject in the French language. In the Dialectici Partitions, Ramus recommends the use of summaries, headings, citations and examples. On calls Ramus's use of outlines, a reorganization of the whole of knowledge and indeed of the whole human life whirl. After studying Ramus's work, On concluded that the results of his methodizing of the arts are the amateurish works of a desperate man who is not a thinker but merely an erudite pedagogue. On the other hand, his work had an immediate impact on the issue of disciplinary boundaries, where educators largely accepted his arguments. By the end of the century, Logician, the logic of Ramus, enjoyed a great celebrity for a time, and there existed a school of Ramists boasting numerous adherents in France, Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. It cannot be said, however, that Ramus's innovations mark any epoch in the history of logic, and there is little ground for his claim to supersede Aristotle by an independent system of logic. The distinction between natural and artificial logic, i.e., between the implicit logic of daily speech and the same logic made explicit in a system, passed over into the logical handbooks. He amends the syllogism. He admits only the first three figures, as in the original Aristotelian scheme, and in his later works he also attacks the validity of the third figure, following in this the precedent of Laurentius Valla. Ramus also set the modern fashion of deducing the figures from the position of the middle term in the premises, instead of basing them, as Aristotle does, upon the different relation of the middle to the major term and minor term. Rhetorician. As James Jasinski explains, the range of rhetoric began to be narrowed during the 16th century, thanks in part to the works of Peter Ramus. Quote, in using the word narrowed, Jasinski is referring to Ramus' argument for divorcing rhetoric from dialectic, a move that had far-reaching implications for rhetorical studies and for popular conceptions of public persuasion. Contemporary rhetoricians have tended to reject Ramus's view in favor of a more wide-ranging understanding of the rhetorical arts as encompassing a range of ordinary language practices. Rhetoric, traditionally, had 5 parts, of which inventio was the first. Ramus insisted on rhetoric to be studied alongside dialectic through 2 main manuals, Invention and Judgment under the Dialectic Manual and Style and Delivery in the Rhetoric Manual. Memory, one of the 5 skills of traditional rhetoric, was regarded by Ramus as being part of psychology, as opposed to being part of rhetoric, and thus dispensed from his idea of rhetoric and dialectic. Brian Vickers said that the Ramist influence here did add to rhetoric. It concentrated more on the remaining aspect of elocution, or effective use of language, and emphasized the role of vernacular European languages. Ramist reforms strengthened the rhetorician's tendency to focus on style. The effect was that rhetoric was applied in literature. Invention involves 14 topics, including definition, cause, effect, subject, adjunct, difference, contrary, comparison, similarity, and testimony. Style encompasses 4 tropes, metaphor, synecdoche, metonymy, and irony. It also includes rules for poetic meter and rhythmical prose, figures corresponding to attitudes a speaker may take, and of repetition. Delivery covers the use of voice and gestures. His rhetorical leaning is seen in the definition of logic as the ars discerendi. He maintains that the rules of logic may be better learned from observation of the way in which Cicero persuaded his hearers than from a study of Aristotle's works on logic. Logic falls, according to Ramus, into two parts: invention and judgment. Here he was influenced by Rodolphus Agricola. This division gave rise to the jocular designation of judgment, a mother wit as the secunda Petri. But what Ramus does here in fact redefines rhetoric. There is a new configuration, with logic and rhetoric each having two parts. Rhetoric was to cover elocutio and pronunciatio. In general, Ramusm liked to deal with binary trees as method for organizing knowledge. Mathematician. He was also known as a mathematician, a student of Johannes Sturm. It has been suggested that Sturm was an influence in another way, by his lectures given in 1529 on Hermogenes of Tarsus. The Ramist method of dichotomy is to be found in Hermogenes. He had students of his own. He corresponded with John Dee on mathematics, and at one point recommended to Elizabeth I that she appoint him to a university chair. The views of Ramus on mathematics implied a limitation to the practical. He considered Euclid's theory on irrational numbers to be useless. The emphasis on technological applications and engineering mathematics was coupled to an appeal to nationalism. Ramusm. The teachings of Ramus had a broadly based reception well into the 17th century. Later movements such as Baconianism, Pansophism, and Cartesianism, in different ways built on Ramusm, and took advantage of the space cleared by some of the simplifications it had effected. The longest-lasting strand of Ramusm was in systematic Calvinist theology, where textbook treatments with a Ramus framework were still used into the 18th century, particularly in New England. The first writings on Ramusm, after the death of Ramus, included biographies, and were by disciples of sorts. Freius Banisius Nancilius, of whom only Nancilia was closely acquainted with the man. Followers of Ramus in different fields included Caspar Olevianus, Johannes Piscator, Hieronymus Treutler, Johannes Althusius, the statesman Emdens, and John Milton. Works. He published 50 works in his lifetime and 9 appeared after his death. Ong undertook the complex bibliographical task of tracing his books through their editions. Aristotelesianum adversions. Brutanae questions. Rhetorici distinctions in Quintilianum. Dialectique. Arithmetique. De moribus veterum Gallorum. Libidis Aries Militia Paris. 1584. Advertisement sur la Réformation de l'Université de Paris. Arroy, Paris. 3 grammaires. Grammatica Latina. Grammatica Greca. Grammaire Française. Scholae Physicae, Metaphysicae, Mathematicae. Proemium Mathematicum. Scala Mathematicum Libri Unus Atraginta. Commentariorum de Religione Christiana.